In this video, we'll be talking about how Newton's laws of physics apply to playing tennis, specifically how the law of inertia and the law of acceleration apply to a tennis serve, as well as how the law of action-reaction applies to a volley, and then also we'll be talking about the law of attraction. So with the first law, the law of inertia states that every system is preserved in either its state of rest or motion unless it is compelled to change its state by forces oppressed upon it. In tennis, we see this when a person serves. The ball is at a state of rest when it's in the hand of the person serving. Force is applied when the person tosses the ball into the air, and the motion of the ball changes as it goes from a state of rest to a state of motion. Continuing on with the example of a serve, we will now talk about how the law of acceleration applies to a tennis serve. The law of acceleration states that the motion of a system will change in proportion to the amount of force pressed upon it. The ball is already in motion when the person serves because they have just tossed it into the air. Force is applied to the ball when the ball has reached the peak of its toss. The force comes from the racket, and with the force, the ball changes its state of motion as it goes from being on one side of the court to the next. Our next example is a volley, and how the law of action-reaction applies to this type of tennis skill. A volley is when a player hits the ball without swinging the racket before the ball bounces. The racket is held still, and the force from the ball propels it across the court back into the opponent's court. The law of action-reaction states that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. When the ball hits the racket coming from the opponent, it stops for a moment as its force travels through the racket at the same time that the racket counters with an equal and opposite reaction force. Thus, the ball bounces off the racket and ends up in the opponent's court. Now we'll talk about the law of attraction. The law of attraction states that every system in the universe attracts every other system with a force directed along the line of centers for the two objects that is directly proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the separation between the two objects. More simply put, systems in the universe attract each other, and the force of the attraction will increase proportionally if the masses of the objects is higher. This law also explains how two objects can interact with each other even if they are not in direct contact with each other. This law is very complicated, and it has to do more so with things on a larger scale, for example, such as planets. This law also incorporates the law of gravitational pull, again having to do with planets. We see this law apply to planets because their masses are so great. Now, for something such as tennis, where the masses of the two systems are smaller, we tend to not see this law apply as much, simply because the masses are so small. While this law may be hard to observe in a tennis ball, a system that has such a small mass, the law is still applied. And this is how Newton's laws of physics apply to playing tennis.